Right. Hi, and welcome everybody. It looks like people are just coming in from the waiting room, so I'll give it another minute. But thanks so much for everybody for joining us today. And while we're doing these brief introductions, it does look like we'll have a little bit of a smaller group today. So it would be great to see people introduce themselves in the chat and maybe any questions that you have for us as we go through. Our goal is to make this as interactive as possible, really a casual Q&A. So happy to have everyone. Okay, so some brief housekeeping information before we start. My name is Kelsey. I work with the Massachusetts Psychosis Network for Early Treatment. So we're excited to join the MHTTC here today to talk a little bit about the COVID vaccine and especially any concerns as they relate to mental illness in this community. So before we start, just to note that your microphones are muted as you join. But please, if you have questions, like I said, we want this to be interactive. So please do feel free to unmute yourself, put questions in the chat. I will be monitoring it along with Alyssa here, who's also with us today. And another note that the session is being recorded. So we'll hope to have this available for people to watch down the line. And if you're one of those people, welcome as well. And another note here, if you do have any questions following the session, please feel free to email us at MHTTC, and you'll also get a follow-up email after the session to do an evaluation. So please complete that as well. So just a quick disclaimer about what MHTTC is and what this talk is about. And a note that so this is an open discussion and for all of our talks, we just ask people to keep in mind the strengths-based, hopeful, respectful conversation, especially I think in the context of vaccines. I really promote that, people are all out here making their own decisions based on the information they have. So we're really happy to provide information about that and hear people's thoughts and conversation around that area. So I'll stop sharing this to let our presenters share. But first, I'll just quickly introduce our first two presenters are going to be specialists that have worked in the vaccine rollout so far in Massachusetts. So first we have Dr. Mary LaSalvia, who is the interim chief at the Division of Infectious Disease at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. So over the past year, she's been the operations section chief for Beth Israel's COVID-19 incident command response, and has played a role in key supporting roles for COVID-19 testing and vaccination efforts across our health system. So Dr. LaSalvia graduated from the University of Toledo College of Medicine and completed her residency and her infectious disease fellowship at Beth Israel. And she also received a Master of Public Health at the Harvard School of Public Health here in Boston. And then our other speaker, Victoria Shokunbi, is a nurse educator with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. So she received her bachelor's degree in nursing from the University of Rhode Island and has worked as a nurse for 11 years with populations that include those with developmental disabilities, mental health diagnoses, and in a forensic mental health facility. And then in 2019, she received a master's in nursing education from Walden University. So really excited about the expertise that they're bringing for us today. But I'll pass it over to Dr. Keshavan to give some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and good afternoon. It's really a nice opportunity we have to bring together experts to address a very timely topic, and that is to address the issue of prevention of COVID. When we are in the pandemic, even though the US is gradually but certainly recovering from this pandemic over the last 1 year, 1.5 years, that has led to a lot of suffering and almost everyone's life affected in one way or the other. But thankfully, in the United States, the pandemic appears to be getting better, even though across the globe, the pandemic still is raging on in many developing countries. The reason we are bringing this group together is because we are a mental health provider community, and we take care of people with severe mental illness. And one thing we have learned over the year is that people with mental illness, especially those with severe mental illnesses, are at double jeopardy. They are both at a high risk for transmissible disease, but they are also at high risk for adverse consequences of COVID-related complications. Just like as a very recent study from New York showed, schizophrenia diagnosis is second only to age as a risk factor for COVID-related death. So which really illustrates the importance of addressing this problem squarely and do everything we can to reduce exposure and prevent adverse consequences of the pandemic in this severely mentally ill population. There are also, even though we now have very effective vaccines, 3 of them at this time, and we are now able to vaccinate younger populations as well. There is one concern that is emerging across the nation, and which is the one of vaccine hesitancy. It's likely that vaccine hesitancy may be particularly more common in people with mental illnesses and serious mental illnesses. And this is an opportunity for us to get a group together of people both who are experts in the COVID infection as well as vaccination, as well as individuals who have expertise in health-related education and peer support workers who have firsthand experience of the kind of concerns that people with mental illnesses have. So that is the composition of the group, the panel that we put together here. Dr. LaSalvia brings the expertise from a medical point of view and from the vaccination point of view. Victoria Shokunbi brings expertise from education, and Robert Walker, Josh Cairns, and Tammie Badura bring in experiences from the peer specialist perspectives. So with that, I won't stand any further between you and Dr. LaSalvia, who will give us an overarching view of where we are in this field. Okay.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you all can see that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I think it's important anytime we think about where we are in terms of this pandemic is incredibly important to think about where we've been. And I think along the way, how we learn from our experiences to make sure that we're putting ourselves in the best position possible to deal with this novel coronavirus and moving forward. And so I always want to reflect on where we've been and the enormous impact that this has had, not just in the United States, but also globally, for us to think forward. And so just to kind of recap about where we are in terms of the burden of illness and death, more than 174 million cases of COVID-19 have been diagnosed worldwide, and there have been more than 3.75 million deaths globally. In the United States, we know that there's been over 33 million cases, and now we're approaching 600,000 deaths. But it is true that we are seeing changes nationally, largely being driven by the vaccine distribution that I'll comment on. But across the United States, we are absolutely seeing differences in the current rate of COVID infection, where the lighter colors are the areas where there's less infections occurring, and the darker colors are where the incidence is still higher. And this very much currently tracks with our vaccine distribution efforts. But in Massachusetts, we've been very fortunate that we are seeing a fall in our number of cases, with now only about 150 to 200 cases per day, a drastically different position than we were in last year at this time, which, to be honest, is still striking for me to think about where I'm sitting talking to you all today versus what we were going through a year ago in our hospital and in our medical center. In the United States, it's a similar story with we are absolutely seeing a fall in cases over the last month since our vaccine efforts really began, and are in the best position that we have been in the US since the pandemic really started in last March, where we began to see a really sharp rise in cases. In terms of the current state of our vaccine distribution, as of yesterday, 2.23 billion vaccine doses have been administered globally. And in the US alone, there have been over 304 million vaccine doses administered, with over 141 fully vaccinated individuals, which is about 42.5% of our population. I'm sure it's higher even today than it was yesterday. And about 60% of our population has received at least a single dose of vaccine. For those who have gotten a vaccine within the 2-dose series. And so in the US, we are doing very, very well, particularly including in the rapid increase that we've seen in individuals at the age of 12 to 15, which that indication has really just been recently approved. And in our older population, where we know the burden of the initial illness and hospitalizations and deaths early in the United States has really been dampened so quickly and significantly with the vaccine efforts in this age group. And so now where we are is really filling the gaps of vaccine in between. And I think it's important to reflect and know that as we look at the data around where the infections are currently occurring, for those individuals who have not yet been vaccinated, there is absolutely still a higher risk of acquiring infection. It's about 70% higher than the standard rates when you look across the board, if you break it down by individuals who are still unvaccinated. And this is why we're working so hard and want to answer any questions and reach out and try to figure out how to continue to expand our vaccine efforts, because we know even if things are improving for those individuals who are unvaccinated, they remain at higher risk. And we want to continue to reach out and work through any barriers. So in terms of the vaccines that are available, there are 3 that are currently approved through the FDA Emergency Use Authorization Order, and our next speaker will be going through that in more detail for you. But all 3 have been approved based on their data around safety, efficacy, and efficacy around not just illness and hospitalization, but also death. The vaccines have a different number of doses, but depending on the type that you consider. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines require 2 doses. That are either 3 or 4 weeks apart, depending on which vaccine type you use. And the Johnson & Johnson or J&J vaccine is a single dose vaccine. So how these vaccines work, I think is the important part of the power of knowledge here, because I think a lot of the questions and concerns that come up around vaccines come from, the question of, it seems like these were, developed so quickly. How is that possible? And how can we do that while ensuring safety? And the reality is that we were in a very good position nationally and globally to be primed, to be ready to respond like an incident such as this, because of all of the existing science and research that had already existed around vaccines. So the mRNA vaccine science, which is what's behind the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, has actually been studied and in place with trials ongoing in different ways and shapes and forms since about 2006. So while the vaccine itself in its use for COVID is new, the technology is not. And so how the mRNA vaccines work is that it's given through the upper arm muscle, like many of our vaccines are. And this science, or the mRNA, basically serves as the instructions for the immune cells to learn how to fight against the COVID virus. So the instructions, or the mRNA, is inside of the vaccine, and it travels to the immune cells as it's given and delivered into the muscles. There, that little piece of information, the mRNA, teaches the cells how to make a little piece of protein that mimics the virus. Because the protein used is the spiked protein, which is how the virus enters our cells and gets us to be sick. So as the cell learns through the mRNA vaccine and creates that protein through our normal machinery, we learn how to produce the protein so that your immune cells can respond to it. That little piece of mRNA can't do anything else. It can't replicate, it can't cause other problems, it can't go anywhere else. And so once it's used and your cell learns how to make the protein, your body gets rid of it and it goes away and it can't do anything else. But your body now knows how to produce those proteins and display them on the surface of the cell. And that's how the immune response occurs. And so I think the important sort of key points and information to think about with the mRNA vaccines is that this is a little sort of piece of information. It's a little code our body uses and learns to make proteins, but it doesn't affect our own DNA. And it doesn't even enter the nucleus of the cell where the DNA lives. And so the mRNA vaccines can't cause the infection in and of itself, and they can't give somebody COVID infection because it's not a true virus. It's not something that can replicate within your cells to either change your own cells or cause infection from COVID-19. The J&J vaccine has a lot of similar attributes, but works slightly differently. And the way it works differently is instead of delivering that little piece of information for the immune response to work off of, instead we use a vector, which is a type of virus. It's not the coronavirus that causes the infection, but it's a different kind of virus that is not able to replicate on its own. And so that vector, or the virus that can't replicate and cause illness, enters into our cell, and similarly, like the mRNA vaccine teaches your cell how to produce the immune response, this virus will use your cell's own machinery to create a little piece of the protein, again, just like the mRNA virus does, that can be displayed on the surface of the cell and teach your immune cells how to respond to the coronavirus and prevent infection. But again, that virus can't do anything else on its own. Once that mission is completed, it goes away, and it can't do anything else on its own because it can't replicate on its own. And so similarly to the mRNA vaccine, this vaccine can't cause COVID-19 infection, and the virus that's used for the vector also cannot cause any types of infection. And this vaccine science has been around for a very long period of time as well. And so there are a lot of very, very significant similarities between these vaccines, but the difference is how the information is given to your immune fighting cells to learn how to fight the COVID infection. And so I think the key points to how these vaccines were developed so quickly are twofold. One is, of the mRNA vaccines, the vaccine itself being used for COVID is new, but the technology is not. The mRNA vaccines have been used for many years, and it was one of science's or medicine's key potential upcoming strategies to actually deal with a pandemic. Because the public health world has known for a long time, based on prior influenza epidemics that have occurred and other viruses over the recent years, that it was possible an event like coronavirus spreading globally may occur. And so there's been a ton of focus and knowledge and attention paid to, if this were to happen, how can we bring vaccines to bear to try to prevent and reduce the amount of illness? And so the mRNA vaccines have been studied for years for things like influenza, Zika virus, rabies, other types of viruses where new vaccine technology could be helpful. That's also true for the J&J vaccine. While it's a different type of vaccine, it's actually been well studied in previous clinical trials, more recently around something that many of us don't even remember anymore, but a few years ago, there was a Zika virus outbreak that was affecting many parts of the world. And this vaccine was used very early to learn how to dampen the transmission of that virus to be used in future use. And so we were ready to be able to use this vaccine technology for coronavirus because how we produce these vaccines, the knowledge was already there. The question was really, what do we need to know about the coronavirus to let us put this technology to bear, bring it to bear as quickly as possible? And so one of the things that occurred in this situation was that there really was unprecedented, rapid sharing of information as we learned more about the virus itself. For instance, as soon as it was understood the sequence of the virus, or sort of the makeup of the virus, it was published and shared very broadly amongst scientists so that everyone could begin work as quickly as possible on developing this vaccine. And there was sharing and transparency about it, unlike anything that I think medicine and the world has seen before. In addition, as scientists were learning how the antibody response was occurring and what were the important features of it, just like we were able to quickly improve and enhance our testing strategies, this also helped us improve and enhance and think about how we could make as effective vaccines as possible. And that's continuing to happen now, even as we learn more about things like different types of variants or how the virus can change over time to make sure that we continue to produce vaccines that are as effective as possible. In addition, there was significant funding brought to bear to reduce barriers that are common as you begin to start clinical trials, to ensure that there were no barriers to learning and allowing us to study these vaccines to ensure optimal safety and efficacy. And again, the key is that we were primed and ready in terms of science and the vaccine development technology to be ready to deal with a virus such as this, to learn as quickly as possible, and then utilize the technology that was already existing. So I think that's kind of the brief summary around how these vaccines work and how they were developed. So I think we're going to move into next the approval and study process, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions too after we're done.
Okay, hi everybody. I am up next. I will share my screen with you. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so I am going to talk to you very briefly about the approval of the vaccines, inequity, and some myths and facts about the COVID virus. So health inequity, unfortunately, is a reality in the world that we live in, and this COVID pandemic really kind of brought that to the forefront. So unfortunately, communities of color and people who are in the mental health community have really been the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. They have higher rates of illness, poorer health outcomes, and an even greater financial burden, which is really unfortunate. There's a lot of different factors that contribute to this, like healthcare access, availability, systemic racism, and mistrust in the scientific and medical community together. Which is why it's so incredibly important for these marginalized communities to really stay informed about the vaccine and also COVID-related information. You know, that way we can just make the best decisions for ourselves, for our families, and really improve the health outcomes. So this next slide really just provides you with some imagery about how a new vaccine is developed, approved, and manufactured. Dr. LaSalvia went into a lot of detail about how it was produced so quickly, which I think is one thing that contributes to some of the vaccine hesitancy. But this is really what it involves when they're looking at a vaccine to be approved or authorized for emergency use. So there's 3 phases that are involved. In that first phase, there's only a few people, 20 to 100 healthy volunteers. And as you can see, as we go through the phases, the number of people who are involved in the study continues to grow. So phase 1 has those 20 to 100 volunteers. Phase 2 gets even bigger. Now we're looking at several hundred volunteers. Phase 3 gets even larger than that, with hundreds or thousands of volunteers. So in each phase, they are really, really looking at a few main things. Is it safe and is it working? Once we kind of see that, we're also looking for what are these side effects like? And as they sort of hone in on that information, then they can get more specific about the size of the dose and those kinds of things. How do people who get the vaccine and people who do not get the vaccine compare to each other? So they're looking at data from every single one of these phases. The data continues to increase, that sample size continues to increase, and they are compiling all of this information. Once this information is put together, they send that information over to the FDA. The FDA takes a long and serious look at all the information and data that they've been given, and they make a decision. And they're looking to see, is the vaccine safe? Is it effective? And then they decide to authorize it only if the benefits outweigh the risks. So with any kind of medical decision that you make, there's benefits and there's risks. Even if it's something as simple as taking a Tylenol or an allergy medication, there's always some sort of risk involved. So like I said, the FDA is just looking to make sure that that benefit is greater than that risk. I also want you to keep in mind, At any of these phases, they can stop continuing on with the research. If they're finding that people are not having good outcomes from it, if we're finding that there are really negative side effects, they can stop and start all over again. They can go back to the drawing board and try something else completely. But it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not like once they get started, they have to see it through. So if things aren't going the way that they hoped, if maybe the vaccine doesn't seem effective, or if those side effects are much worse than they anticipated, they can absolutely stop the trial and continue on. So emergency use authorization. All 3 of the vaccines on the market right now have emergency use authorization. So that means that they have the information from those first 3 phases of the trial, and they have about 2 months worth of data after that. So after someone is fully vaccinated with the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, they follow those volunteers for 2 months after that to make sure that they're doing well, to make sure that they continue to not have any side effects, to continue to make sure that they haven't contracted COVID, that that medication, in this case, the vaccine, is continuing to work. So once they get that emergency use, and many people have been vaccinated, now they start to apply for full approval. So for the Pfizer vaccine, they applied for full approval back on May 7th, and Moderna was even more recently. They applied for a full approval on June 1st. So you may hear the term biologics license application and full approval used interchangeably. They mean the same thing. The major difference is that when we're applying for full approval, these vaccine companies need to provide 6 months of follow-up data to the FDA, where, like we talked about before, emergency use authorization only needs 2 months of follow-up data. In the case of the COVID vaccine, they even have this huge sample size of people that they're able to look at. And I received my vaccine back in December, my first dose. So I'm sort of coming up on my 6 months for that. There are some other minor things that sort of change once a vaccine is given that full approval. And that major change is that the drug companies, Pfizer and Moderna in this case, can actually start to advertise their medication or their vaccine on television. That full approval and biologics license even goes into even greater detail about what are they going to put on the label, what will they be allowed to say in advertisements, and so on and so forth. So there is a little bit of a difference, but the greatest difference is the amount of time that we're looking at the follow-up data in order to apply for full approval. So approval process. So Pfizer and Moderna have compiled all this information, 6 months of follow-up data. They send everything over to the FDA. Then the FDA comprises a panel, and that panel of people is looking for data about quality, consistency, and safety. I won't read you the list of who is on the panel, but you can see it's a really, really well-rounded group. We're looking at physicians and chemists, pharmacists, microbiologists, but also people who are clinical study site inspectors, manufacturing and facility inspectors, labeling and communications experts, toxicologists, statisticians. So a really nice, well-rounded group of people who are all able to take a long, hard look at that data and make some really informed decisions about this vaccine. And then they will most likely decide to give it full approval. From the research that I've done, despite the fact that so many people have been vaccinated and we have so much information, it's a big deal. And it could really take months until the vaccine does have full approval, but it looks really good based on the data that we have, based on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines that have been given so far. So I won't spend too long on this slide because I don't want you to look at the myths as much as I want you to look at the facts. These are, I think, some of the most common myths. They're the ones that I hear the most often when I researched on the CDC website. These are the ones that I saw the most frequently as well. So we'll talk about the myths and then we will dispel them with some facts. So Top 6, COVID vaccine causes COVID. The vaccine causes infertility. It won't actually protect you from COVID. It's not safe. The side effects are dangerous. And the adverse effects from the vaccine may not appear for years after vaccination. So those are the myths. More importantly, here are the facts. The COVID vaccine does not cause COVID-19. And people will say things like, I had a friend who got their first dose of Pfizer on Monday, and then on Thursday, they came down with COVID. And that is a possibility. And that's most likely because that person was exposed to the COVID-19 virus before they got their vaccine. You also have to remember, in a shot that has a 2-dose series, you're not fully protected until 2 weeks after you received the second dose. And if you're getting a 1-dose vaccine, you're still not protected fully until 2 weeks after that 1 dose. So there is this sort of in-between waiting time while your body is still building up that immunity. Infertility. As of right now, there is no data suggesting that the COVID vaccine, or any vaccine for that matter, is linked to infertility. Is the vaccine effective? So when they first studied vaccines, they were looking at them sort of in a laboratory setting, a really controlled setting. But now we have even better data because we can look at the vaccine effectiveness in that real world setting. And the results have been really, really promising. You're looking at about 90% effectiveness in preventing severe illness and death from the COVID-19 vaccine in your 2-dose vaccines. Another one is that the vaccine isn't safe. So we talked about the 3 different phases and looking at the vaccine for safety. They continue to study this vaccine for safety. Over 306 million doses of the vaccine were given in the United States as of yesterday. So that's a really, really big number of people that we're able to look at and study for safety. We're doing really well, and it's not like we just stop following the vaccine for safety. The FDA continues to look at data from people who have been vaccinated. And people in the medical world, they have a vaccine adverse event reporting system, and they continue to report any unexpected or adverse side effects from the vaccine, and that continues to be followed. So we continue to look at the safety of the vaccine every single day, which I think is great. I think it's really reassuring and lets us know that we're always looking for more information and more evidence. So other people have said the side effects from the vaccine are dangerous. So most medications, most vaccines, most things that we do have some kind of side effect. We do know so far from what we have seen with people who have received the COVID vaccine, most of those side effects are mild to moderate. They include muscle pain, chills, nausea, fatigue, a headache, pain at the injection site. So things that, we don't look forward to, but nothing that, we can't handle and get through. So that benefit outweighs the risk. You do have a risk of getting these things, but the benefits are that you will likely not have severe illness from COVID. The other one that I hear very often, the myth I hear really often, is that we don't know the long-term side effects from the vaccine. So the good thing to know is that evidence of vaccines in general point to the fact that usually we don't see any adverse effects from a vaccine more than 12 weeks past vaccination. Once you get past that 12 weeks, it's unlikely that you see any kind of adverse side effects. So you don't necessarily have to worry about, but what about 5, 10, 15 years from now? Because the studies show that that's not really an issue, and that's nothing that we have seen in any vaccine. So that is the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing.
Perfect, thank you. So as I said before, please, as we're talking, feel free to throw questions in the chat. But this next portion of this panel will bring it over to our peer specialists in the group. So we have Rob Walker and Tammie Badura joining us from some of our programs in Massachusetts. So Rob is a certified peer specialist, and he leads the Office of Recovery and Empowerment at the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. And then Tammie is a certified peer specialist that works with the ServiceNet Prep program in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And along with being a peer, Tammie is also a vocational and educational counselor, does some mobile outreach, and is a RAP facilitator. So both have a pretty direct experience working with our community in Massachusetts around mental illness, and have some firsthand experience themselves. And also both have received their COVID vaccine. So really glad to have you guys to talk about your own experiences and the things that factored into those. So I'll just spotlight everyone here. But my first question for both of you is just what was on your mind when you planned to get the vaccine? What did you think about, and what was really the motivating factor for you?
So I couldn't wait to get mine. So Dr. Keshavan talked in the beginning about high-risk populations. So I have a serious mental illness, and I'm a little older, and I also have diabetes. So I was very anxious about wanting to get one and waiting to get the opportunity, because when I watched, if you remember early on, there was like stage 1, these groups of people could get it, stage 2, these groups. But I was like all the way down in stage 3 or whatever, category number 3. So I was afraid I'd have to wait till April or May to get mine. But luckily, because I worked at DMH in a building with people who received inpatient services, I got my vaccination in January. So I was so relieved, because I had a lot of anxiety wanting to get it.
Yeah, for me, I also have chronic medical conditions. I have asthma, and I have some brain issues, and I was really hesitant, not really sure, what would happen to my mental health and my medical aspects of what needed to be good for me. So yeah, I had to really consider, was it safe to get? Was it going to put any more health risks to brain issues that I have, or my asthma? Was it going to trigger asthma where I would have bad asthma attacks? So yeah, I had to look into the different things, but as time went on and research came out and people were talking about it, and I realized that, okay, when can I go get this? Because at the end of the day, it's going to be okay. And, I won't be sick, and I won't be suffering any problems because of it. And it'll get me back into being in the world where I need to be, working at the office and supporting the people in which I support.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that kind of both of you touch on, is that people who have more chronic medical conditions are both in this high risk group, but you also are kind of used to having to put a little bit extra thought into health decisions given the other things going on in the picture. That's a great point. So our next question is just, can you explain what your experience was like? So how did you get the appointment? What was it like when you had your appointment? And then did you have any side effects following up from it?
Mine was not typical. I got email from my boss. They have a slot open the next day at 8 a.m. Can you make it? you might not get another one till later. So I was like, heck yes. So it was nice that I didn't have a lot of time to agonize over it. But so I have to say this, it's an interesting way to remember it because I got my first shot on Inauguration Day in January. So I figured that was new beginnings of more than one thing. And then the second shot I got on my youngest daughter's birthday. So they were both two memorable days. But I had side effects from both. I had nausea and tiredness in the first one, and then really like 3 days of exhaustion after the second shot. They weren't fun, but I'm sure they weren't as bad as having COVID.
Yeah, I too had a really great experience of setting up the appointment for the vaccine because I work in the program with people that I was able to be receiving the vaccine sooner than later. So that, to me, it was like, oh, okay, I can get the vaccine, I can set up an appointment, let's just do it. Let's stop procrastinating about it. Let's just do it because I may make that one difference in someone's world. And if I can do that, then okay, let's do it. And when I registered, I was like, I went down and got the first vaccine, very, very smooth. I believe my first one was in February. I can't remember the exact date. I'm not good with that, but yeah, sore arm for the first vaccine. The second vaccine, I felt like I was ran over by a train. I was pretty sick. I had the nausea. I had bad body aches, muscle aches, very tired. I slept for a solid 3 days. But yeah, nothing. I would prefer, like Rob said, I would prefer to be sleeping for 3 days and have some sore arms or body muscles or whatever compared to having COVID.
What I like, I'm gonna put on my DMH hat for a second, but what I liked about what I like about DMH policy, both for employees and for the people we serve, is that there was no coercion involved, and that I can absolutely say it was a totally voluntary effort that for the people with serious mental illness that we serve in our programs, we spent a lot of time giving people the facts, but there was never any coercion about getting a shot. And the same with employees. They made it clear from the top down that it was voluntary and that it was every individual's choice. So our jobs as employees to the people we serve was really acting as coaches, not as sort of big brother saying, get the shot. And I think that effort really paid off too, in terms of how many people chose to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I can agree with that. We too, as somebody who runs groups with other staff members here at ServiceNet, we just informed every participant and staff member of things that we could inform. We talked about the pros and the cons. We would run community meeting and talk about the pros and the cons of it. And we would process with our people anything that needed to be processed. With being a peer, I was able to say lived experience with them. So I could say, okay, yes, I felt like this, but then it got better and it wasn't a forever thing. Whereas COVID would be a longer, if we ended up with COVID, it could be a bad outcome. It could turn into a hospitalization, or it could turn into things that we don't necessarily want. And I think that spoke volume especially coming from somebody with lived experience, and people trust us. You know, they know that we aren't going to sugarcoat things, because that's not what we do, and we will be upfront and honest. And I think that speaks volume.
Yeah, well, and from what you're saying, there's been a lot of fear and stress in the past year, and it's completely reasonable to expect that to kind of show itself in this effort as well. The same kinds of stress that people have been feeling up till now. So yeah, you both touched on, your role in the conversations that you've been having, but really our last big open question is if there is any advice that you have for families or individuals who are unsure about whether they should get the vaccine, or, in the work that you've been doing, what do you point people towards who are trying to make that decision for themselves?
To caregivers, be it professional or family members, that really people have the ability to make that decision on their own with the right information given in the right format, that it doesn't matter what your diagnosis is, you're still able to make that decision given the facts, and odds are it will be the right decision. And I think also arming yourself as a family member with the facts that Dr. LaSalvia and Vicky presented about what the facts are about it, and acknowledging people's mistrust of the system. I think as users of the public mental health system, or as recipients of public mental health service, there is a natural distrust sometimes of psychiatry and of public mental health. But I think trusting people to make their own decision and giving people the information they need to make the decision is important.
I also encourage them to talk to their primary care physicians. Talk your worries out with them. I know that I reached out to my primary care and I said, I'm interested in this, but let's talk about what this looks like for me. Let's lay out all my medical issues on the table and let's talk real talk. I processed also with my therapist. And I think that if we encourage the people in which we serve to do both that, it may help them process the next step. As well as talking to family members. Some of the people in which I serve, they're scared to death because they don't want to get a COVID shot and risk something with their family. They think that if they get the vaccine, it's going to risk somebody in their family. And I think that by providing that sort of information, that it won't happen, and sitting there and listening to them and hearing their concerns and encouraging them to talk to their doctors and talk to their therapists and talk to their friends and make a pros and cons list, that at the end of the day, they will go out and get the vaccine. And I'm seeing that more and more.
Yeah, I think as someone who works in public health, there's a lot that we can say of, this is the best option on the general population level, but really that one-on-one interaction of like, what's the best decision for me in my situation, it makes a lot of sense, and I can see being really helpful. Anything else that you guys would want to add to any of this?
I heard a great analogy that somebody used about people's fear of the side effects, in that think about wearing a seatbelt. There's probably 1 in a million times where somebody got into an accident wearing a seatbelt and got injured harder because they couldn't get out of the seatbelt, or because they dislocated their shoulder because of the jerk. But you don't think about the million other times that the seatbelt really saved lives. So you have to focus on where you, as the prevention part, not the 1 in a million chance or 1 in 10 million where you might get a blood clot. Those are odds you don't want to play.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Okay, well, I'll open it up then. We have 2 questions. Here, I'll remove your spotlights because these can be for
Mhm.
everyone. Let's see. Okay, so we have 2 questions from earlier for the Q&A, but again, encourage people to bring their own as well. The first one, and I guess this is more for Mary and Vicki, but can you talk a little bit about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? The news that came out earlier this year, and then the restarting of giving that vaccine. Is that available in Massachusetts, and what should people keep in mind with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Vic, do you want me to start and then I'll let you add? Okay. So, with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, after it was launched, so in the clinical trials data, there was really no signal of any risk of contribution to blood clots or low platelet levels. But as very large and broad vaccination began, both in the United States and internationally, there was a signal of a very small number of cases. It was actually 6 in the first about 6 million doses that were given, where there was a flag that some patients were seen who had developed blood clots in the setting of their platelet counts being low, which is, in terms of where you typically see blood clots, more of an unusual pattern to have been seen. And so I would say that was the first signal, one, that our safety system was really working, because that is a really incredibly rare event. But our safety signal and system that was devised through the ACIP and the CDC and the FDA was successful in flagging a very early, very rare signal. And so because in the United States, we had the real amazing benefit of having a second type of vaccine available, which was the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, we were in a position where we could pause the distribution of J&J while we took a look at all of the data and all of the information without actually impacting our access to vaccines for patients. And so with that, the FDA and the CDC decided to pause the vaccine together for 2 reasons. The most important reason was to make sure that providers who are caring for patients who have been vaccinated are aware of this and know what to look for, know the labs to recognize, and know how to manage it when it happens. And then the second piece was to make sure that since even more vaccine had been given since those first reports occurred, to pause to make sure that the signal wasn't any greater or wasn't any more frequent than that 1 in a million or less rare event. And so with that, it was paused for a few weeks, and then the ACIP came back and met again and reviewed an enormous amount of data where there really was no greater signal, where this looks like a very rare, again, kind of 1 in a million type event. But we recognized that one of the patient groups where it may be slightly more frequent was women between the age of 18, because that's the earliest age that's authorized for this type of vaccine, to the age of 50. And we also recognize that this may be similar to some of the side effects that are also very rare that we've seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine throughout the rest of the world, because it's a similar type of vaccine. And so with that, in all of the review, because this was still a very rare event overall, everyone felt safe moving forward with continued vaccination with the use of the J&J vaccine. But the information that's given when somebody's vaccinated with this was modified so that everyone who's moving forward with vaccination is aware and know what to watch for. I would say that we're in a place where different groups have dealt with this differently. For me, as a physician, I think it's most important that we have a little bit of a luxury in the United States, to be honest, where we have 3 equally efficacious vaccines. And so I think it's important for women in that age group of what may be slightly higher, but still exceedingly rare risk, for them to be empowered to have that information and to consider that information as they're making their decision around which vaccine they pursue. And if there's any concern around that risk, to move forward with getting either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. But it is absolutely true for some people, a 1-dose vaccine is the right vaccine for them because there's barriers to coming back for that second dose, or just concerns around side effects and missing work. I mean, there's so many such individualized decisions and things that you have to think through with the vaccine that I think that's where knowledge is power, and you make the decision around which vaccine is right for which patient as you're speaking with them. So that's how we've approached it. But J&J is absolutely readily available in the state of Massachusetts and throughout the United States, and is being actively used internationally. I think it's a safe vaccine to be used. I think it's an effective vaccine to be used. But everybody needs to, at this point, make an individual decision about which vaccine is right for them, and that's our job to help support. I don't know, Vicki, if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, to kind of go off of what you said, as scary as it was when the information first came out, in another way, it was also really, really reassuring that nobody tried to hide it. They readily made the information available. We let people know what was going on. We paused the vaccine. We didn't pretend like nothing was happening. And they did even more research, which I think is a testament to how important the safety of the vaccines is to the medical community. So in a way, it's just reassuring that they didn't kind of produce these vaccines and say, okay, now everybody's on their own. They continue every single day to make sure that they're safe and to look for adverse events or unexpected events. So I think it's reassuring in that sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And the other question I have on here, this is probably at best, Rob and Tammie, for you both from the mental health side. But what would you suggest for people who have needle phobias? Or are there any specific resources?
That's really funny that this question came up. Not funny, I don't mean it funny, but I mean it in a good way, is that actually just came up in a conversation, needle phobias, with multiple clients that I serve here at the program. And so when they say to me, I'm afraid of needles, what's going to happen? Needles it's going to be painful. It's going to be terrible. And they go on they can find any reason to be afraid of needles, which is very valid. It's very valid. And we want to acknowledge that when that's happening. But we also want to create a space where they're aware of, it's like the flu vaccine, or it's like getting blood drawn, or it's like vaccines that you've had when you were a child. And when they realize, oh, well, getting blood isn't all that bad. And I'm like, well, think about getting blood takes a little bit longer than a vaccine. And in a matter of seconds, your vaccine is done. And they realize, oh, I think you're right. And so I also encourage them to wear headphones, listen to music, hum a song, hum happy birthday in their head, hum happy birthday out loud through the song. Think of something magically funny that they just pop in their head, and it's just funny to them. And then they come back and they say to me, wow, I didn't even need to hum. I didn't need to sing. I didn't need my earphones. I didn't need to do anything like that. It was very quick and painful. So that's what I suggest around that.
I also suggest breathing exercises to feel more control over it rather than letting the anxiety get out of control. And truthfully, I had another issue with where I was getting the shot. So my prescriber gave me Ativan to take a half an hour before the shot, and that sometimes for short term, that's the solution. So talking to your provider about it too sometimes is helpful.
Can I add something too?
Oh, please go ahead.
As a nurse who, believe it or not, I hate getting shots. Giving them is like, no big deal. Hate getting them. if you tell the person who's giving you your vaccine that you have a fear of needles, a lot of times they can give you a little bit more support and talk you through it. I know if I'm giving someone a shot who's nervous versus someone who thinks it's not a big deal, my approach will be completely different. So don't be afraid to say something. When I get a shot or get blood drawn, because I absolutely hate it, I try to focus on something I'm not great at doing, like saying the alphabet backwards, or starting from 100 and trying to count down in like multiples of 7, something that takes a little bit more concentration. So I'm not necessarily paying attention and focusing my energy on the shot that I'm getting.
Yep.
Love that.
Like a good situation to think about, do you talk to your provider around which vaccine is right for you? And depending on how big of a challenge it is a one-dose vaccine the right vaccine for that person at that time? So it's another where we have this benefit of you've got multiple options in front of you that you can make the choice that's right for you, depending on where you are and where you have availability to go.
Yeah, and thank you, Raquel. I noticed she posted a recent article from the APA as well, covering this. So it's super helpful. Okay, so that is the list of questions that I currently have. I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat right now, but I'll leave space for that. To give just a quick wrap up of, because I know we've covered a lot today. So just to go over some of the notes that I have. So we heard some great background. I definitely learned some things about how the mRNA vaccines and the J&J vaccine actually physically work, which is really, I think, helpful information to know as we talk about, arming yourself with this knowledge. And then also the fact that the scientific community was really primed and ready to respond to a pandemic like this. This wasn't something that was a complete surprise to us. And the quick rollout of the vaccines is really a testament to that, and evidence to how well our system is working, which is really nice to hear. And also that communities of color and people in the mental health community are both being hit harder by the pandemic and have some genuine reason to be worried about things coming from the official health organizations. So really getting those facts and knowing what is available and what's out there and having that empowerment to make those informed decisions for themselves is really critical, especially in this stage of the vaccine rollout where vaccines really are openly available. And then Tammie and Rob, thank you for just sharing your experiences that, there are people do experience side effects, but in the grand scheme of things, comparing that to what a potential infection with COVID might feel like is definitely a way to rationalize that to yourself and kind of put everything into perspective. And just for all of you, thank you for the great work that you're doing with these communities to really get the word out there and answer questions in this really open, honest way. So really appreciate that. I will share some resources that we have as far as how to get the vaccine in Massachusetts. I looked it up earlier, and we're at a place now in the vaccine rollout where we're lucky to have lots of capacity for walk-in appointments, same-day scheduling. It's not difficult to get a vaccine in the way that it was in the first couple months of the rollout, kind of, Rob, as you were describing. So I'll pull up and screen share a page that we put together on our MathNet website. Let's see. So just to show that in Massachusetts, we have some knowledge or some information on if the vaccine is safe, some fact sheets specifically answering questions from people who have mental illness. So this is really targeted for our community. But just as far as eligibility goes, that everyone ages 12 and up here really is eligible for the vaccine. You don't need to show insurance or ID to get it. And really broadly, these vaccines are available for walk-in appointments. The homebound vaccination line is open to people who need it. So if you call this number, they will come to you and you'll be able to schedule an appointment that way. And as far as transportation goes, free Lyft rides are available. Again, this homebound vaccine program, and also free rides through Mass Health. So we'll actually, Alyssa, if you can put a link to this site in the chat, just so people have access to it. But I just wanted to show that to again drive home that the state is really investing a lot into making sure that this is an open and available thing to people, which is really great. So I'll just look through. Thank you, Alyssa, for putting that in there. So nothing else coming up in the chat, but is there any other closing remarks that that you all want to bring up?
You know, I think I would just say that I think the most important thing, I think, for individuals who haven't yet felt comfortable around going forward with vaccine is to just ask for them to continue to reassess it, you know, continue to read more about it, continue to talk to people who've been vaccinated, and like try to set timelines. I'm going to think about it every week. I'm going to think about it every other week. You know, set a plan to continue to think about when the time is right for you, because I think our goals at continuing the vaccine rollout, you know, aren't ending anytime soon too. We want people to be vaccinated as quickly as possible for their own health, but there is such an individualized decision for many people. And so for me, it's, if today's not the right day, let's talk about it again tomorrow. And then we'll talk about it again on Monday, you know, but continue to ask questions and continue to seek that information. Don't just decide it's no, continue to reassess over time.
And it's okay to be skeptical, and it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to be weary about it, and find the facts and make your judgment based on the facts, not your own fears.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think an excellent point to end on too. We'll embrace the uncertainty, but keep an open mind and keep looking into it, because there is still more information and more news coming out. And like Dr. LaSalvia said, we're not stopping anytime soon. So we'll be here and available. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope this was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.